I've always loved hiking, not for any fancy reason like connecting with nature or escaping the city. I just liked the silence, that quiet space where the only thing you heard was your own footsteps, the wind, or a stream nearby. It gave my mind a break. No notifications, no traffic, no people. Just me and the trail. It was late October when I decided to take a trip to the northern part of the country, near the mountain border. I had about a week off work and figured I could squeeze in a solid 4-day hiking trip before the real cold kicked in. I picked a place I hadn't been before, Brady Ridge. It wasn't well known, which I liked. Not many people posted about it online. The trails weren't crowded, and the terrain looked challenging but manageable. A lot of steep climbs, old forest roads, and long stretches between campsites. I planned everything out. I had my gear, tent, food for 5 days just in case, satellite map, compass, portable charger for my phone, and a backup battery. I packed heavy but safe. I wasn't trying to go ultra light. I wasn't rushing. My goal was to take my time and move through the woods slowly, enjoying the quiet. I started on a Thursday morning. The sky was clear, air crisp but not cold, and the forest looked burned with autumn. Yellows, reds, and browns everywhere. The trail started as a gravel road, then thinned into dirt and roots the deeper I went. I passed an old, rusted sign that said, Brady Ridge Trail, 16.2 miles, and kept going. Felt good, peaceful, like I had escaped everything. That first day was fine. I hiked about 8 miles and camped near a dry creek bed. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and lay in my tent reading until it got dark. It was cold at night, colder than I expected, but I layered up and stayed warm. I fell asleep fast. Day 2, I woke up early and felt good. My legs were a little sore, but that was normal. I packed up and kept moving. The terrain got steeper, and I passed through long switchbacks where you couldn't see the trail below or above. I barely saw any wildlife except for a few squirrels and one deer in the distance. I didn't see any other hikers. No footprints, no litter, nothing. It was like I had the whole ridge to myself. By late afternoon, I reached a small plateau with some flat ground and a view that opened up to the west. I could see tree-covered hills rolling into the distance. That night, it got even colder. I could feel frost forming on the inside of my tent by morning. I told myself I needed to speed up and finish the loop before it snowed. On the 3rd morning, I repacked and checked the map again. According to the trail loop, I had 2 options to get back to the start. One was the long way, looping down through a valley and then back up about 12 more miles. The other was a dotted line I hadn't noticed before, marked faintly across the satellite map, labeled Old Logging Road, not maintained. It cut the return hike down to about 6 miles. It was a straight shot northeast, right through the middle of the forest. I checked my compass, lined up the road on the map, and thought about it. It was late October. Days were shorter. Clouds were rolling in from the west, and I didn't feel like hiking uphill in freezing rain the next day. The shortcut made sense. It wasn't marked on the physical signs anymore, but it was still visible on satellite. I figured it was just overgrown, not dangerous. I took it. First, it wasn't bad. The road was wide enough for a small truck and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Trees were growing in the middle of it, and parts of the road were broken with grass and roots, but I could follow it. It was mostly downhill, which helped. I figured if I kept a good pace, I'd be back at the trailhead by evening. About 2 miles in, the road started to change. It narrowed fast. The trees got closer together, and the brush thickened on both sides. It was less of a road now and more of a rough path. It was hard to tell where the ground ended and where it dropped off on the sides. Everything looked the same: brown, dead leaves, tree trunks, and rocks. Then I noticed the tire tracks. Old but definitely tire tracks. Deep ones, probably from logging trucks. They were sunken into the road, like someone had driven through here when the ground was still soft. I walked alongside them, thinking they might guide me forward. But soon they veered off into the brush, where the road curved around a bend. That's when I saw the first marker, a red plastic ribbon tied to a tree. I stopped and looked around. Then I saw another one about 10 feet ahead. It was faded, flapping gently in the wind. It was strange because these weren't on the official trail map, but I figured maybe hunters had marked this for deer season or someone used this path for off-grid hiking. Either way, I kept going. I followed the ribbons for maybe half a mile. Then I stopped seeing them. The road, or what was left of it, became uneven. Rocks everywhere, tree roots crisscrossing, and deep ruts filled with muddy water. The ground was soft in some places and slick in others. I had to use my poles to keep from sliding. I kept checking the satellite map on my phone. The shortcut line was still there, but my blue dot was drifting off it slightly. I zoomed in and tried to match the curves, but the road didn't match what was on screen anymore. I kept walking. That was the mistake. The slope started dropping faster. I could feel it in my knees. I was going downhill too fast now, and I didn't want to turn back uphill. The road curved again and dipped between two ridges, and suddenly everything got darker. The trees were taller, thicker. Pines mostly. Less light came through. The air felt damper, colder. I tried to slow down, but there was no flat ground. Every step was a cautious one. The dirt was loose. At one point I slipped and landed hard on my left wrist. It throbbed but wasn't broken. I wrapped it with a bandage from my pack and kept moving. I thought I'd find the road again after the dip, but instead, it leveled out into a thick, overgrown area. Bushes and vines tangled across what used to be a path. I pushed through slowly, trying not to rip my jacket. Every few minutes I looked down at the GPS, but now the satellite wasn't loading well. My signal had dropped. I only had the compass and general direction. I kept moving northeast. Hours passed. The trees changed again, thinner this time with more undergrowth. I was tired. My legs ached, and my water was getting low. I hadn't seen a clear landmark or trail marker in over an hour. Just trees and brush. No sound except for the wind. That peaceful quiet I liked had turned into something else. Something that made me feel like I was being watched. There was no reason for that. I hadn't seen anyone in days, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I stopped to rest on a log and ate a granola bar. I checked the map again, still loading. I turned off the screen and looked around. Everything looked the same. Brown, gray, dark green. No ridges, no valleys, no signs. My tracks were already fading behind me, covered by leaves blowing in the wind. I got up and kept walking. At some point, I found a creek. Small, maybe 3 feet wide, running slowly. I remembered seeing a creek on the map, but I couldn't tell if it was the same one. I filled my bottle and treated the water. I decided to follow it. Most water runs downhill. Downhill should take me toward the base of the ridge, which might put me back on a road or trail eventually. The light was fading fast now. I had maybe an hour before dark. I didn't want to set up camp here. The ground was uneven, and everything was wet, but I didn't have a choice. I moved a little further downstream until I found a patch of ground between two trees. I cleared it as best I could, set up the tent, and crawled inside. That night was hard. I barely slept. Every little sound made me freeze. Cracking branches, rustling leaves, wind shifting through trees. I kept imagining footsteps. The tent felt like paper. My knife was next to me, my headlamp on my chest. I stared at the ceiling of the tent for hours. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up, everything was wet. Mist had settled in the trees, and the ground outside was slick. I packed up and started following the creek again. I was tired, hungry. My hands were cold. My legs were stiff. After about an hour, the creek led into a swampy area. Deep mud, fallen trees, thick brush. I tried to walk around it but kept slipping. My boots sank up to the ankle in some spots. I had to use a branch to balance. My feet were soaked. I started to panic. The thought of being stuck out here for another night made my chest feel tight. I climbed up a small hill to get a better view, but all I saw were more trees. Then I heard something, an engine. Faint, distant, but real. I turned and scanned the trees. It was coming from the left, maybe half a mile away. I couldn't see anything, but I followed the sound. I pushed through trees, slid down a slope, and burst out onto a gravel road. A real road. It looked abandoned, but it was flat and wide. Tire marks, not old ones, ran along the middle. I turned right and walked fast. Then It was early August when I decided to take some time off from work and get away from the noise of the city. I'd been working 6-day weeks for the last few months, and I was mentally fried. My doctor told me my blood pressure was high, and I hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night in weeks. I needed quiet, nature, so I packed my gear, checked my map, and planned a 3-day solo hike through a national forest a few hours from where I lived in northern Oregon. I wasn't trying to do anything extreme, just a loop trail through pine-covered hills, some scattered lakes, and a small ridge with a view of the valley. The trailhead started at a gravel lot barely marked off the highway. I left my car there around 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. The plan was simple: hike the trail counterclockwise, about 12 miles the first day, camp by a lake, another 10 miles the second day, and a short 7-mile return stretch on the third. I had my 65-liter pack with me, loaded with gear I'd used plenty of times before: water filter, GPS, compass, paper map, snacks, 2 hot meals per day, emergency kit, bear spray, and my sleeping gear. I always over-prepare when I'm alone, but that's what keeps me comfortable. The weather was good that morning. Mid-60s, a bit of breeze, clear skies. I moved at a steady pace, hiking through dense pine woods that let in streaks of sunlight. The trail climbed slowly for the first few miles. Occasionally, I'd pass a rusted trail marker nailed into a tree, or find small stacked stones left by other hikers. Nothing unusual, just peaceful woods. I passed a few creeks and filtered water around noon, ate a granola bar, and kept going. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake I planned to camp at, Lake Harlan. It was quiet, glassy, and surrounded by tall pines. There were 2 clearings just off the trail, perfect for tents. I set up my small 1-person shelter and stretched out on a rock by the shore. I didn't see a single other person the whole day, just birds, insects, and the occasional chipmunk. It was exactly what I needed. That night, the wind picked up a bit. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to it shift through the trees. The tent rustled every few minutes. I don't sleep well outdoors, even though I do it often. The silence always makes my thoughts louder. Around 1 a.m., I thought I heard something moving through the brush, but it was probably a raccoon or something. I eventually drifted off. The next morning, I woke up stiff but well-rested enough. Made some instant oatmeal and coffee, packed up, and started day 2. This stretch was supposed to be the most scenic part of the loop, climbing the ridge, crossing the saddle, and winding through high alpine terrain for a while before descending back into forest. It was about 11 a.m. when I hit the ridge. From up there, I could see rolling hills in every direction, forests stretching as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful. The trail followed the edge for a while, curving along the top of a steep slope that dropped into a basin. That's when I saw the fork. It wasn't on my map. The main trail curved left along the ridge like I expected, but a narrow path, faint but visible, peeled off to the right. It looked like it went down into the basin below, winding through trees and disappearing behind a low hill. First, I ignored it. I followed the main trail for another 20 minutes, but the slope was steep, and the sun was right in my eyes. I checked my map again. It looked like both paths probably met up again in the same area below, if the fork was just an old connector trail. I wasn't completely sure, but I figured taking the narrow path might shave off half an hour. Maybe more. That was the first mistake. The moment I left the main trail, the feeling changed. The new path was tighter, overgrown in places, and littered with small rocks and broken branches. Still, it looked like it had been used before. Not fresh, but not forgotten either. I walked cautiously, hoping it really did connect below. I kept checking my GPS, but the tree cover got thicker as I dropped into the basin, and the signal weakened. After about 40 minutes, I realized the trail had almost vanished. What started as a narrow but visible path turned into just matted grass and patches of dirt. Then nothing, just woods. I stopped walking, looked around. It was quiet, dead quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. I pulled out my GPS again. No signal. I backtracked a few steps to try to find where I lost the trail, but everything looked the same. I took a slow breath and sat on a rock. I wasn't panicking yet, but I knew I was off course. I ate a protein bar and tried to remember the terrain from the map. The basin wasn't huge. I figured if I kept heading downhill, I'd eventually cross the main loop trail again. I walked for another hour. No trail, no markers, just more trees. I realized I hadn't seen a cairn, blaze, or boot print in over 2 hours. I kept my compass out now, checking it constantly. The shadows were changing, and the sun had dropped behind the hill by 4 p.m. It got darker fast. I needed to find flat ground before night. That's when I found the structure. It wasn't a cabin, just 4 wooden posts in the ground with a torn blue tarp flapping on top. Next to it was a rusted folding chair and a pile of old beer cans. I stood there staring for a while. The place looked abandoned, maybe even years ago, but someone had stayed there once. Someone had camped out here way off trail. I walked closer. There was a fire pit with blackened stones, and inside it, half-burned paper. I didn't touch it. I looked around, listened. Still no sound. I backed away and kept walking. By 6 p.m., it was too dark to hike. I had to camp. I found a small flat area under some pines, cleared the ground, and set up my tent. I ate a cold meal, too tired to light the stove. My legs ached. My feet were blistered. I kept the bear spray next to my sleeping bag. I was deep in unknown woods with no signal and no trail. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to every little sound. Branches snapping, rustling. At one point, I thought I heard something brush against the outside of the tent. But when I unzipped it and looked, there was nothing. The third day was worse. I got up early and packed fast. My legs were stiff. I tried heading west, thinking that was where the main trail should be. But the woods only got thicker. Brambles cut at my arms. My boots slipped on mossy rocks. I crossed a dry creek bed and found an old deer skeleton beside it, sun-bleached and broken. Around noon, I reached a low ridge and climbed it to get a better view. That's when I saw the clearing. It looked like a road, a dirt road. I started moving faster. I didn't care if I had to walk another 20 miles. I just wanted to hit something man-made. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't a road. It was a wide strip of land where the trees had been cleared years ago, maybe for logging but never used. Fallen trunks lay everywhere. Deep ruts ran through the ground. A rusted metal sign stuck out of the weeds, but the writing was gone. I kept walking along the edge of it for almost an hour. Then I saw a tire track. Just one. Old but real. I followed it downhill. Eventually, it led to something I never expected to find. A truck. Just sitting there. The doors were gone. Moss covered the hood. The glass was broken. I checked the license plate, but it was too rusted to read. The inside was filled with leaves, but I saw an old backpack shoved under the seat. Pulled it out. It was faded green. Inside were some rotted clothes, a cracked compass, and a notebook. The paper was soggy, but I could still make out some writing. It looked like a journal. Short entries. The last one said, *Day 4. Still can't find the trail. Something's wrong with the compass. Food is low. Heard something near the tent last night. Need to keep moving. That was it. I dropped the pack and stood there in silence. That night, I didn't camp. I walked until after dark, using my headlamp. I started yelling every few minutes, hoping someone might hear me. Nothing. Just trees and more trees. By day 4, I was running low on food. My water filter cracked after I dropped it crossing a log. I had to drink straight from a stream. My stomach started cramping. I kept moving west, trying to stay in a straight line. Every now and then, I'd stop and scratch marks into trees with my knife. It was the only way to know I wasn't walking in circles. Around 3 p.m., I found the first real trail marker, a faded orange ribbon tied to a branch. I almost cried. I followed it. After half a mile, I found more ribbons. Then a trail, a real trail, dirt packed from boots. I didn't know which direction led back to the parking lot, but I didn't care. I followed it for hours. Around 7 p.m., I saw the highway, just a sliver of black through the trees. I stumbled out onto the road, filthy, shaking, and sunburned. A car passed me 20 minutes later. I flagged it down and got help. It had been 4 full days since I'd last seen a person. I filed a report with the ranger station the next day, told them about the fork in the trail. I don't really know what pushed me to do that hike alone. Maybe it was the stress from work, or maybe it was just the idea that I could finally disconnect from everything. I had done a few solo hikes before, but never something like this. Never this remote, never this unmarked. The trail I picked wasn't even on most official maps. I found it on a hiker's forum. Someone posted photos of this mountain range with rough directions. No GPS coordinates, just trailhead notes like, park near the metal gate by the broken fence, and follow the river upstream for 2 miles until the trees open up. That kind of thing. It sounded wild and untouched. That's exactly what I wanted. No tourists, no signs, just nature and me. I drove out on a Thursday morning in late September. I figured I'd have the whole weekend and maybe a little bit of Monday if needed. I brought enough food, water, a water filter, basic survival gear, a knife, a headlamp, a flashlight with backup batteries, and a small emergency tent and sleeping bag. I didn't plan on needing all that, but I liked being prepared. The drive took about 6 hours from where I lived. The last 2 hours were rough gravel roads through forest that barely fit my car. My tires kicked up stones constantly. I kept checking the time and the gas. When I finally saw the metal gate mentioned in the forum post, I felt a weird mix of relief and worry. The gate was there, the broken fence too, but it all looked way more isolated than I expected. No signs, no other cars, just endless trees in every direction and the soft hum of wind through them. I parked just off the road, packed up my stuff, and locked my car. The air smelled like pine and cold dirt. The wind was light. The sky was that dull gray you only get in late autumn. Clouds that look like they've been stretched thin across the whole sky. It was around 3 in the afternoon. I figured I'd hike in 3 or 4 hours and then set up camp before dark. First, it all went smoothly. I followed the river upstream just like the post said. There was no real trail, just some flattened areas where it looked like someone walked before. I had to cross the water a few times using fallen logs. Every few hundred feet I stopped and looked behind me, trying to memorize the terrain just in case. I kept thinking asterisk, as long as I follow the river back, I'll be fine. Asterisk, I didn't mark my trail. I wish I had. After about 2 hours of following the river, the forest opened up into a large clearing. It looked like a field that had been burned years ago. Old, blackened tree stumps poking out from golden grass that reached my knees. I crossed it slowly. The wind was stronger there, felt colder too. I saw the sun dropping toward the horizon. The forum post said there was a ridge just past the clearing, and a nice flat spot for camping. I found it, a flat area on a slight rise, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides and the ridge behind it. No signs of people, no trash, no sounds except the wind and a few birds. I set up my tent, boiled some water, and ate a basic meal. After that, I walked around the camp and looked for firewood. I wasn't going to build a fire, but I wanted to be prepared in case it got colder than expected. When it started getting dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag. I read a few pages from a book on my phone and then turned it off. The quiet out there was heavy. I could hear every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves. I laid awake for a while, listening. My thoughts kept drifting to my car. Felt like it was miles away. I reminded myself this was what I came for. Peace, silence, space. I don't know what time I fell asleep, but sometime in the night I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Everything was still quiet. Then I heard it, a single crunch, like a boot stepping on dry leaves. Not far away. I held my breath and listened harder. Another crunch, a pause, then 2 more. Closer. It wasn't an animal, at least not one walking on 4 legs. The steps were too slow, too even. I sat up in my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight. I pointed it toward the tent flap but didn't turn it on yet. I waited. The wind moved through the trees. Then silence. I clicked the light on and unzipped the tent just a little. I pointed the beam outside and scanned. Nothing. Just trees, grass, fog starting to roll in low to the ground. My heart was pounding. I stayed like that for a long time, maybe half an hour. Eventually, I zipped the tent shut and laid back down, but I didn't sleep. Not really. I just waited for morning. When the light started coming through the tent walls, I packed up quickly. I didn't eat. I just wanted to start hiking back. The problem was the fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker now. I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. Still, I knew the direction. I headed toward where the river should be, but I never found it. I walked for over an hour, thinking I'd run into the water at any minute. But the land just sloped and twisted, and I kept seeing the same types of trees and rocks. Felt wrong. I wasn't walking in circles exactly, but something was off. The sun was somewhere behind the fog, but I couldn't tell where. I didn't bring a compass, thinking the river would be enough. Around noon, I sat down to rest. My legs ached, and I was sweating under my jacket even though the air was cold. I checked my phone. No signal. I opened my map app, but it just showed blank. I ate a little trail mix and drank some water. Then I heard it again. A crack, far off but loud, like someone stepping on a thick branch. I froze. The forest was quiet again. Then another crack, closer, then nothing. I stood up and turned slowly, scanning the woods. I saw nothing moving, but the feeling in my chest got worse. Something was wrong. I felt it deep, like a warning. I started walking again, this time faster. I didn't care about the trail. I just picked a direction and stuck to it. My boots crushed through underbrush and kicked rocks. I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I walked for hours. My legs burned. I started stumbling. The fog never lifted. It just clung to the trees and made everything look like it was changing shape. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes that disappeared when I turned. I told myself it was just nerves. Sometime in the late afternoon, I found something strange. A boot print, in the mud, big, not mine. It was fresh. I stopped breathing for a second. Then I saw another one. It was facing the way I came, like someone was following me. I moved quickly now, almost jogging. I couldn't tell where I was going, but I didn't want to be near those prints. The fear was stronger than anything else. I didn't care if I was getting more lost. I just wanted distance. It started getting dark. I had no idea what time it was, but the fog turned darker and the light faded. I found a thick clump of trees with low branches and set up my emergency shelter. It wasn't a full tent, just a tarp I strung up between two trees. I laid down inside it and wrapped myself in my bag. I didn't sleep. At some point during the night, I heard the footsteps again. This time closer, much closer. I laid completely still, holding my breath. The steps moved slowly around my shelter. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching, then silence. Then the soft scrape of something brushing the tarp. I clenched my fists. My heart beat so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't look. I just stayed frozen until light finally started breaking through the fog. When I looked outside, nothing was there. No prints, no marks, but I knew what I heard. I packed up and kept moving. No food, just water. I was dizzy, and my legs felt like they weren't working right, but I kept going. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. My battery was under 20%. Midday, I found something else. Plastic bottle. Empty. A brand I didn't bring. Then a granola bar wrapper stuck in a bush. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever was out here had been close, watching me. The next few hours felt like a blur. My thoughts were jumbled. I kept walking, sometimes in a straight line, sometimes curving around trees and rocks. I fell once and cut my hand. Blood soaked into my glove. The fog finally started to thin near evening. The trees got sparser. I saw hills ahead, rocky ones. I climbed one, hoping I'd get a view. At the top, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A camp, down in the trees. A tarp, a rope, something hanging from it. Clothes, a fire pit made of rocks, ashes, and what looked like bones in the ashes. I backed away slowly. I didn't want to make a sound. Then I heard it again. Steps, this time running. From the side, I took off down the hill. My feet slipped and I tumbled halfway down, slamming into rocks and scraping my elbow. I didn't stop. I've always loved hiking, not for the thrill or the views, but for the silence. The quiet that settles over the trees, the steady rhythm of my boots against dirt, the way the forest doesn't care about anything I left behind. I'm not a hardcore mountaineer, not one of those people who scales peaks or camps out for days in the wild. I just like long hikes, day hikes, nothing too wild. That's what I told myself when I picked a random trail in a state I'd never hiked before. It was in northern Idaho. I was passing through for work. I had a free weekend and decided to stretch my legs, get out of the cheap motel room I'd been stuck in for days. I did a quick online search and picked a lesser-known trail near the Montana border. The photos looked beautiful: forests, creeks, light elevation gain, not too many people. That last part was what drew me in most. I packed my day pack like I always do. Water, snacks, a small first aid kit, power bank, a printed trail map just in case my phone died, and a whistle. I also threw in a small knife I always carry, not because I expected trouble, just out of habit. I left the motel around 7 a.m. and drove up a winding road until I reached the trailhead. There were only 2 other cars in the gravel lot, and I didn't see anyone around. Perfect. The trail started off easy, wide, clear, with soft pine needles underfoot. The air was cool, and the forest smelled damp but clean. I took a deep breath and started walking. After about 45 minutes, I passed a fork. According to the map, the left trail continued along the main loop. The right trail wasn't labeled, but it looked well worn. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I figured I could follow it for a while and circle back. The forest was dense, but not disorienting. Trees were tall and thin, spaced far enough apart to see the slope of the land and the shafts of light filtering through. About 10 minutes down this unlabeled trail, I started noticing things felt a bit different. Not wrong exactly, just different. The path narrowed and the ground sloped downward. It was still a trail, still easy to follow, but it felt like no one had walked it in a while. The tree branches hung lower here. They brushed against my shoulders and arms, and I had to duck a few times to avoid getting smacked in the face. I kept walking. I should have turned around then. I should have played it safe. But something about the way the trees stood, the way the sun angled through the branches, made it feel like I was entering a place I wasn't supposed to be. That should have been a warning sign, but I ignored it. I kept walking, telling myself I'd turn back soon. Another 20 minutes passed. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker since I left the main loop. I stopped and checked my phone. I had 1 bar of service, just enough for GPS to load. I pulled up the location. Nothing. The trail wasn't even marked on the map. My little blue dot floated on a blank patch of green. I zoomed out, tried to reorient myself, and realized I'd walked much farther off the main trail than I thought. I told myself to stay calm. I turned around and started walking back. But it only took a few minutes before I realized something wasn't right. The trail I was following didn't look the same going back. I looked for my footprints but couldn't see any. The ground was soft, but there were pine needles and broken twigs everywhere. Too much debris to leave a clear print. I checked my compass app and tried to walk north, assuming that would lead me back toward the main loop. But nothing looked familiar. The trees got thicker. The trail faded. Soon, there was no trail at all. I stopped walking and looked around slowly. Every direction looked the same. Tall trees, underbrush, patches of moss, and silence. The forest was deathly still. No birdsong, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I wasn't just off trail, I was lost. I stood still, trying to remember every step I took, but the more I thought about it, the more twisted everything became in my mind. Did I go down a hill? Cross a creek? Couldn't remember. My heart started to pound. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. I didn't panic, not at first. I took out the map and tried to match it with the compass direction. But the map didn't help anymore. I had no idea where I was on it. I pulled out my phone again. No bars this time, just a spinning circle where my location used to be. I had about 2 hours of daylight left, maybe less, since the forest was so thick. I started walking again, slow and careful, looking for anything familiar. A broken branch, a shoe print, something, but everything looked the same. Even the light filtering through the trees didn't help. It kept changing directions as the sun sank lower. I started marking trees with small cuts from my knife, thinking I could at least track if I walked in circles. I walked for another hour and found nothing. That's when I started feeling watched. It's hard to explain. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. But something about the forest around me felt different, like the trees had shifted somehow. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see a bear or a person, but there was never anything there. I told myself it was just my nerves, just fear creeping in, but it didn't go away. I found a small clearing just before dusk and decided to stop. I didn't plan to be out overnight, but I had no choice. I gathered some dry twigs and made a small fire with my lighter. I didn't have a tent or sleeping bag, just an emergency blanket. I sat close to the fire, arms wrapped around my knees, trying to stay calm. That night was the longest of my life. The forest came alive in a way I wasn't prepared for. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the brush made my skin crawl. I kept the fire going, feeding it sticks until my pile ran out. Around midnight, I started hearing something that sounded like footsteps. Not constant, not close, but they were there. Slow, spaced out, as if something or someone was circling the clearing from a distance. I froze. I didn't move. I just listened, my eyes wide, my hand on the knife. The footsteps came and went all night. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky turned gray with morning light, I packed up and started walking again. I was exhausted, hungry, thirsty. I still had half a bottle of water and a protein bar. I rationed both, chewing slowly, sipping only when I absolutely needed to. By midday, I was stumbling. I fell once and scraped my palm on a sharp rock. The cut bled more than I expected, and I wrapped it in a clean napkin I found in my pack. My mouth was dry, my lips were cracked, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The worst part was the silence. No planes, no traffic, no human sounds at all, just my breathing, my footsteps, and every now and then, something moving through the woods nearby. Never close, never far, just always there. I found an old animal trail later that day. It was faint but clear enough to follow. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to move. I followed it for over an hour until it led me to an old fire road. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was wide and clear. I cried when I saw it. I followed the road for what felt like forever, and just before the sun dipped behind the mountains, I saw tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones. That meant someone had been here recently. I kept walking. I didn't let myself stop. Eventually, I saw a metal gate in the distance, a Forest Service gate. Beyond it was a dirt road, real, solid, something that would lead somewhere. I didn't stop walking until I found a ranger's truck parked on the shoulder about a mile further. It was empty, but I waited there for over an hour until the ranger returned. When he saw me, his eyes widened. I must have looked rough, dirty, scratched, pale, and shaking. He gave me water, asked me questions, and drove me to a ranger station. I didn't say much, couldn't. My voice cracked when I tried, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He told me I was lucky. That area had miles of unmarked forest. People had gotten lost out there before. Some were never found. I stayed quiet. He didn't know the worst part. It wasn't the hunger or the thirst or even the fear of being alone. It was the footsteps, the ones that followed me in the dark, the ones that stayed just far enough away that I couldn't see them. But I knew they were there. I never figured out what they were. Probably nothing. Probably my mind playing tricks. That's what I tell myself now. But when I go hiking these days, I stay on marked trails. I check the map twice. I tell someone where I'm going. And I never, ever follow an unmarked trail again. Because getting lost is bad. But feeling like something doesn't want you to be found? That's worse. And I felt that. I felt it out there. Alone. in the trees, in the silence, and I never want to feel it again. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something peaceful about being away from the noise, away from people, away from the constant feeling of having to reply to messages or be somewhere. Just trees, wind, dirt, and me. I used to do these solo hikes every few weeks, mostly sticking to trails I already knew. But last August, I decided to change that up and hike a new trail I hadn't tried before. One that I'd read about online but hadn't seen in person yet. It was called Hornbeam Loop, located about 3 hours from where I lived. The trail wasn't very popular, and that was part of the reason I picked it. Less crowded meant more solitude. I packed up the night before standard gear, food for 2 days, a full water bladder, filter pump, compass, trail map, multi-tool, headlamp, emergency whistle, first aid kit, bear spray, and my small tent. I had done enough of these hikes to know how things could go wrong if I got lazy with planning. I even printed out the topographic map because phone signals could never be trusted out there. I left home around 5 a.m. to get there by 8. The drive was uneventful. The parking area was a patchy gravel lot with space for maybe 10 cars. And when I arrived, only one other car was there. An old green Subaru with a faded bumper sticker that said, "Trust trees." That made me smile for a second. After checking that I had everything, I locked up my truck and started walking toward the trailhead. The air was cool, the kind of cool that makes your fingers feel stiff but not freezing. The sky was overcast, but not in a threatening way. I hit the trail at 8:11 a.m. I remember the time because I took a photo of the wooden sign nailed to the tree that marked the start of the Hornbeam Loop. It read, "Hornbeam Loop, 13.4 miles. Intermediate to difficult, bring water." The first few miles were beautiful. Tall trees stood like guards along the narrow dirt path. The trail had clearly not been maintained in a while, overgrown in spots with some fallen branches across the way, but that just made it feel wilder. I passed a small creek at around mile 3, where I refilled my water and had a granola bar. No sounds except for wind, birds, and the occasional rustling in the brush. At around mile 5, the trail began a steep ascent. I wasn't expecting it to be that bad, but it kicked my ass. There were switchbacks every 50 feet. It felt like they would never end. Each time I turned a corner, I thought I'd reach the top, only to find another slope waiting for me. By the time I got to the summit, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my thighs burned. I sat on a rock and looked down through the trees. The view would have been amazing if it weren't for the haze. After resting for about 20 minutes, I kept going. The loop was supposed to circle around the ridge and descend on the other side, eventually curving back to the trailhead. But something strange started happening after I passed the summit. I noticed that the trail markers, the small red blazes painted on trees, started getting harder to find. At first, I thought I just wasn't paying attention, but then I realized they weren't just spaced further apart, they were gone completely in some places. I kept going forward, thinking maybe I just entered a section where they hadn't been repainted in a while. My map showed that the trail should continue in a curved line around the ridge before cutting through a narrow valley, so I kept following what looked like a path. About a mile later, I started to get that uneasy feeling. The trail was thinning. It looked like maybe it had once been used but hadn't seen any traffic in years. The dirt was covered with leaves and moss. I pulled out the map and tried to figure out where I was. The problem was, without any visible landmarks, just trees and rocks, I couldn't tell. I decided to backtrack a bit and find the last red marker I'd seen. I turned around and started walking back, but after maybe 10 minutes, I couldn't find it. I should have seen that last switchback by now. I walked faster, a little panic rising in my chest. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd just gone off by a few feet, and all I had to do was zigzag until I hit the trail again. But 30 minutes later, I was still surrounded by trees in every direction, and the path I thought I'd followed had vanished. I sat down, took off my pack, and tried to breathe. I pulled out the map again and started scanning for possibilities. Maybe I had crossed over into one of the old logging roads I'd seen mentioned online, but those hadn't been used in decades and were no longer shown on most maps. I checked my phone, no signal, not even one bar. I wasn't surprised. but it still sucked to see. I ate some jerky and drank water, trying to think clearly. That's when I heard a sound behind me. Not an animal. Something heavier, like a boot snapping a stick. I froze and turned. Nothing there. My heart was already beating fast from the stress, and now it kicked up a notch. I scanned the trees, looking for any movement, but saw nothing. I called out, but then quickly stopped myself. I didn't want to draw attention in case it was someone I didn't want to meet. That part of the forest suddenly felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be walked through. I know that doesn't make much sense, but it's how it felt. The air seemed denser. Every footstep echoed weirdly. I tightened the straps on my pack and started moving, trying to walk in a straight line, hoping I'd eventually hit a trail. I walked for what felt like hours. I checked my watch. It had only been 45 minutes. The woods all looked the same. Tall, thin trees, dark green moss, wet leaves. No signs of other people. No wrappers, no footprints, nothing. I started talking to myself, not to stay sane or anything like that, but just because the silence was getting too loud. I tapped the trees every few feet to hear some kind of sound other than my breathing. Around 4 p.m., the sky started darkening. I was still nowhere near any recognizable trail. I hadn't seen any markers or signs in over 5 hours. My feet hurt. My water was running low. I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp there for the night. I cleared away some sticks and rocks and pitched my tent. It wasn't perfectly flat ground, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be off my feet. I ate a protein bar and sat with my back against a tree, watching the sky dim to a dull blue. No stars, too much cloud cover, still no signal on my phone. I thought about using the emergency beacon I kept in my pack, but it felt too early for that. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't starving. I was just lost. Embarrassingly lost, but still alive. I climbed into my sleeping bag once it got cold enough and tried to sleep, but I kept hearing noises, footsteps, snapping twigs, crunching leaves. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, but some of the sounds were too deliberate, like pacing. I clutched my bear spray and stayed alert, barely sleeping that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly and started walking again. I kept trying to go downhill, thinking that I'd eventually reach a road or a creek that could lead me out. I passed a dried-up stream bed and followed it for a while. It twisted through the trees and dipped down into a deeper part of the forest. That's where I saw it. An old hunting shack, falling apart, half covered in moss and vines. The door was barely hanging on. I was about to keep walking when I saw something shiny inside. Metal. I stepped closer and peeked in. An old stove, a rusty lantern, and what looked like empty cans. No one had been there in a long time. I opened the door slowly, creaked loud enough to make birds scatter nearby. Inside, there was a small wooden chair, and in the corner, a pile of torn fabric, maybe an old sleeping bag. The place smelled like mold and damp wood, but it was shelter. I marked the door with a red piece of tape so I'd know I'd already checked it if I ended up circling back somehow. That thought scared me, getting turned around again and walking in a giant circle without knowing it. I kept moving. I saw a ridge in the distance and decided to climb it. Maybe I could get a better view. It took me about an hour, but once I got to the top, I could see a break in the trees to the west. It looked like a clearing, maybe even a dirt road. I headed in that direction, moving fast. I tripped a few times on roots, but I didn't care. My adrenaline was high again. I reached the clearing around noon. It wasn't a road. It was a dried-out swampy area with broken logs and muddy ground. I stood there, trying to decide what to do next, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Boot prints. Not mine. Not recent either, but not old enough to be totally washed away. And next to them, drag marks, like someone had pulled something heavy. I followed the prints for a bit, but stopped when I saw the end of the trail. A hole. A deep pit dug into the ground. It looked unnatural, square-shaped, like someone had dug it intentionally. It was too deep to see the bottom clearly. I didn't smell anything, but the air around it felt stale. I turned around and walked fast. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to see what was down there. Whoever had made that hole had done it for a reason, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I kept moving west. Around 3 p.m., I found a wide trail, fresh tire marks, maybe from an ATV or truck. Relief flooded through me. I followed it for miles. I had been hiking solo for a few years before this happened. I wasn't new to it. I had done long trails, camped in remote places, dealt with bad weather, and had even been chased by an angry moose once in Alaska. So when I took a week off from work and decided to explore a lesser-known trail in western Montana, I didn't think much of it. I had gear, maps, backup power, and experience. What I didn't have was a good sense of how bad things could get if one small detail went wrong. The trail was called Red Ridge Trail. I had read about it in an old hiking forum. It wasn't marked well on modern maps, but the GPS coordinates and rough directions made it look like it connected to another well-used loop, forming a big figure-8 route. It passed through old burned forests, exposed ridges, and a few alpine meadows. It was about 40 miles in total, and I planned to do it in 4 days. 2 days up one loop, a night at the high ridge, and 2 days down the other side. That was the plan. The first day went smooth. I parked my car in a pullout next to a gravel road and hiked the first 10 miles without any issues. The weather was clear, cool, and dry. I saw deer, a few elk tracks, and a lot of wildflowers. The trail wasn't crowded. In fact, I didn't see a single person. I didn't think it was odd. Some trails are just quiet. I made camp that night next to a small creek under a group of tall pine trees. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove and wrote in my notebook while listening to the water and wind. I slept well. The second day took me higher. The trees got thinner, the trail rougher. I started seeing signs that this part of the route wasn't used often. Fallen logs hadn't been cleared. The dirt path was barely visible in some places. But I had my GPS loaded with the waypoints, and it was working. I followed the route, taking my time. By mid-afternoon, I reached the first open ridge. It was beautiful. I could see for miles, rolling hills, distant snowcaps, even a lake far down in the valley. I stopped for lunch there, leaning against a boulder and feeling the wind hit my face. It was the kind of moment that reminded me why I hiked. Solitude, nature, quiet. But that's also where things began to shift. As I crossed the ridge and started looking for the trail that dropped into the next basin, my GPS started glitching. The screen froze for a few seconds. Then it jumped. I reset it, and it showed I was still on the route. I followed it, but the path was getting less and less visible. No footprints, no marks on trees, just grass and loose dirt. Then, around 5:30 p.m., I came across a downed tree with a weathered orange ribbon tied around one of its branches. It looked old, faded by years of sunlight. It wasn't the same kind I had seen on other parts of the trail, but I took it as a sign that I was still on the right track. I kept going. I should have turned around there. The slope ahead was steep. I had to use my hands in a few spots. The trail was more of a suggestion now. A patch of trampled grass here, a faint line in the dirt there. I checked my GPS again. It was frozen again. I turned it off, waited, turned it back on. It worked, but now the trail line was gone. Just my location dot on a blank screen. I was tired and low on water. My last refill had been that small creek, and this ridge didn't have any streams. I knew the next campsite was supposed to be near a spring about 3 miles ahead, so I pushed on. The terrain got worse. More rocks, steeper drops, loose soil. At one point, I slipped and cut my palm on a jagged rock. It wasn't deep, but it bled enough to make me stop and wrap it. That's when I realized how far away I was from anyone. There was no cell signal, no nearby towns. I hadn't seen a human in 2 days. I kept walking. Around 7 p.m., I reached a narrow section of the ridge. On one side was a sharp drop. On the other, a steep slope covered in loose gravel. The wind picked up. I had to crouch to stay stable. That's when I saw a strange shape ahead of me. It was a small structure, looked like an old trail shelter, one of those 3-walled huts you sometimes find in remote areas. But this one didn't match any shelter on my map. It was made of stone and wood, covered in moss. The roof had caved in. The door frame leaned to the side. It looked abandoned for decades. I went inside just to take a break. The floor was covered in leaves and animal droppings. I didn't stay long. I dropped my pack, drank the last of my water, and looked at my GPS again. Still no trail data. I sat down and took out my paper map. It was hard to tell exactly where I was. I guessed I had drifted a bit off course, maybe a quarter mile. Not too bad, I thought. I could find the trail again in the morning. I decided to camp near the shelter since I was exhausted. I set up my tent beside the ruins, anchored it with rocks because of the wind. I boiled water from a small puddle using purification tablets, made some dry food, and tried to relax. But something felt off. All night I kept hearing sounds. Not animals, just sounds, like footsteps on gravel. Then silence, then a rustle, then nothing. No voices, no animals, just strange soft noises in different directions. I tried to tell myself it was deer, or maybe marmots, but it didn't feel like that. I slept lightly, waking up every hour. When morning came, I packed quickly and moved on. I wanted off that ridge. I tried to head toward where the trail should be, using my compass and map. I figured I'd reconnect with it within a mile, but I didn't. Instead, I ended up on a slope full of dead trees, hundreds of them, all burned and black. A fire must have passed through here years ago. There was no trail, just ash and broken limbs. I moved slowly, watching every step. By noon, I was out of food and dangerously low on water. My GPS battery was dying. I carried a solar charger, but it wasn't charging well in the clouded sky. I started feeling the kind of fear that doesn't come from one big moment, but from hours of small mistakes adding up. I stopped to rest on a fallen tree. That's when I saw the boot. It was old, torn at the sole, half buried in the dirt. I dug it out and saw a sock still inside. The boot was weathered, almost falling apart, but clearly human. Nearby, I found a rusted canteen and what looked like part of a jacket sleeve. Someone else had been here, and they hadn't left in a hurry. They had never left. That changed everything. I didn't feel alone anymore. Not in a comforting way, more in a something bad happened here way. I kept moving downhill, hoping I'd hit a creek or something familiar, but the slope kept going and going. At one point, I turned and saw the ridge far above me. I had lost a lot of elevation. Too much. My feet started to ache. I hadn't sat down in hours. My hands were dirty and dry. My mouth felt like cotton. I started having thoughts I didn't like. Thoughts about lying down and not getting back up. But I kept walking. Around 3 p.m., I saw something that looked like a trail. It was narrow and overgrown, but it had signs of being man-made. Small rocks placed like steps, a faint path through the grass. I followed it, hoping it would lead me somewhere. Didn't. It led me to another ruin. Not a shelter this time. It looked like the foundation of a cabin. Just a few beams, a rusted barrel, and some broken glass. Nature had taken it over. Trees had grown through the floor. It was covered in moss and insects. I searched the area and found nothing helpful. No water, no supplies, no directions. I kept going. I remember falling. Not a big fall, just a stumble on a loose rock. But I twisted my ankle. Sharp pain shot up my leg. I sat there, cursing myself. I had no signal, no food, barely any water, and now a bad ankle. I wrapped it with a bandage from my kit and limped forward. I had no choice. As evening came, I finally heard it, water, a thin trickling sound. I followed it, almost crawling at times, until I found a small stream. I dropped beside it, filled my bottle, and drank more than I should have. I filtered and drank again. It was the first relief I'd felt in over a day. I made camp there. No tent, just a sleeping bag under a tree. I didn't care about bears or rain anymore. I was too tired. I barely slept. In the morning, I followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead to a road or a bigger river. It did. By late afternoon, I saw tire tracks, faint but real, a logging road. I nearly cried. I followed it for miles. Eventually, I found a small sign with numbers painted on it, a logging company tag. I kept going. Around 6 p.m., I heard an engine. I waved like a madman until a dusty pickup came into view. A forestry worker stepped out, surprised to see me. He didn't say much, just gave me water and let me sit in the truck while he called it in. They took me to a ranger station. I told them my route. They told me the trail I had tried to take hadn't been maintained in almost 15 years. A hiker had gone missing out there a day. I'd taken a few days off from work because I needed a break from everything. The deadlines, the emails, the noise. I just wanted silence, clean air, solitude. I picked a remote hiking route in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I'd found it in a small online forum where a guy talked about a forgotten trail just a few miles off one of the forest roads near Sula. It wasn't on any of the maps. He said it was overgrown and barely used, but that it had some of the best views he'd seen in the area. That's what I wanted, something far away from crowds. I wasn't some beginner. I had hiked solo before, camped out in the wild plenty of times. I had my GPS, maps, a compass, bear spray, enough food for 4 days, and 2 big water bottles with a filter. I packed smart, light but safe. I left my car on a patch of grass beside the gravel road, left a note on my dashboard with the date and expected return, just in case. I stepped into the woods around 9 a.m. The air was crisp, cold for June. It smelled like pine and damp soil. I didn't see anyone else around. The trail was hard to see at first. I had to walk a couple hundred feet through thick brush before I started to notice something that resembled a narrow path. Trees were tighter here, branches low and sharp. It didn't look like anyone had walked through in a long time, but I trusted the GPS and followed the faint impressions in the dirt. A few hours in, the forest opened up slightly, and the sun poured through the tall pines. I took a breath and relaxed a little. Felt good to move, to hear only birds and wind. I hiked about 8 miles that first day, uphill mostly. It was slow going because the trail was almost invisible in places. I had to stop often to make sure I wasn't straying. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing next to a narrow stream. It looked like a good place to set up camp. I pitched my tent and boiled some water for my food. I didn't even build a fire. I just sat there listening to the water and the creak of trees in the breeze. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because of any noise. Actually, it was too quiet. I'm used to hearing owls or the distant snap of twigs from animals moving around, but here it felt like nothing lived. Even the bugs were quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the roof of the tent, counting the slow breaths I took. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, I think, and woke up at sunrise. Day 2 started off fine. I filtered water from the stream, ate, and packed up. I planned to hike deeper into the woods and maybe find a spot with a higher elevation to see if I could catch a view. As I moved further in, I noticed the trail becoming less and less visible. At points, I had to rely entirely on my compass. My GPS had started acting weird, not dead, just jumpy. It would say I was 30 feet west, then back where I stood. I figured the trees or elevation were messing with the signal. Still, I made note of landmarks and checked my compass regularly. By early afternoon, I was in deep forest. Everything was darker here. Trees were packed in, trunks wide and roots tangled. I hadn't seen any signs of animals. No tracks, no droppings, no movement. And it bothered me. I tried to tell myself maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe this part of the forest didn't get much activity. But even that didn't sit right. Forests don't go completely dead unless something is very wrong. Around 3 p.m., I slipped. I was climbing a steep incline when my boots slid on a patch of loose soil and I fell sideways. My knee smashed into a rock, and I slid about 10 feet down, scraping both arms on the way. I shouted out, mostly from shock. I wasn't badly hurt, but my knee swelled up fast. I sat there for a long time trying to decide if I should turn back. But I figured it would be slower going downhill on a bad knee, and I was sure I'd find a better path forward if I just kept climbing. I wrapped my knee, tightened my boot for extra support, and pushed on. I made maybe 2 more miles before I stopped. The pain had gotten worse. I couldn't bend the knee much, and walking started to feel like dragging dead weight. I was sweating even though it was cold. I found another clearing and set up camp. I boiled water again and forced myself to eat, but I felt sick. That night, the quiet came back, and it felt heavier. No wind, no water, no animals. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was watching. Not in a paranoid way. It was just this deep feeling in my gut that something knew I was there. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. When the sun finally came up, I knew I had to turn back. My knee was worse. Every step hurt now. I broke camp fast and checked my gear. I marked the direction I had come from and started walking back. But everything looked different. The path was gone. Trees I had passed didn't look familiar anymore. I followed my compass and GPS, but the GPS kept skipping. The needle on the compass spun slowly now and then before settling. I told myself it was probably the magnetic rocks in the area, but that didn't make me feel better. Hours passed, and I realized I wasn't getting closer to where I started. I was circling, I think. At one point, I found my own footprints. I had walked in a big loop. That's when panic started to set in. I stopped, dropped my pack, and sat down. I drank water, forced a few bites of a protein bar. I breathed in deep. I knew if I panicked, I'd make worse decisions. I had at least 2 more days of food. I could still try to retrace my steps. I picked a direction, due north, and forced myself to move slow and steady. The pain in my knee was bad, but walking kept it from stiffening up too much. Around sunset, I found what looked like a man-made sign. It was just a dead tree with a broken rope hanging from it. Might have been from some old trail marker or logging site. It gave me hope. I camped nearby again, hoping the next day I'd find a real trail or road. The next morning, things got worse. I woke up to find my tent partially collapsed. One of the poles had snapped. It looked like it had been bent, not broken by force but by pressure. That didn't make sense. There was no wind, no rain. I checked around the camp but saw nothing. Still no animal signs, no prints, no broken branches, just more of that heavy silence. I packed my things as best I could and started walking again. But the forest had changed again. Trees looked even thicker. Light barely came through. I stopped trusting the compass. I started marking trees with my knife so I wouldn't circle again. I cut notches deep into bark every few hundred feet. After a couple hours, I found one of my own marks again. I had circled anyway. My hands were shaking by now. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just used the tarp and slept next to a big fallen log with my back to it. I kept my knife in my hand. I don't know what I expected. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes kept scanning the trees. I don't know how many days passed after that. I stopped keeping track. My knee gave out entirely. I had to use a thick branch as a cane. My food ran out. I tried to ration, but it wasn't enough. I started eating wild plants, berries. I made sure they were ones I could recognize, but I started to feel weak anyway. My body hurt. I smelled bad. My socks were soaked through, and my feet had started blistering. At one point, I thought I saw a cabin. It was deep in the woods, maybe 100 yards away, hidden between trees. I limped toward it, but it vanished. There was nothing there. I was losing my mind. I tried screaming, shouting for help even though I knew there was no one around. My voice echoed off the trees, but nothing came back. No birds flew. No branches moved. It was like I was in a photograph. On what I now know was the 7th day, I collapsed. I had tried to climb a small ridge, thinking maybe I could get a view of something, anything, a road, a cabin, even a fire pit. But halfway up, my knee twisted the wrong way, and I fell. I slid back down, hit my shoulder on a root, and just lay there. My water was gone. My filter bottle had cracked after I dropped it the night before. My lips were cracked. I felt cold even though the sun was shining. I don't remember blacking out, but I must have. When I woke up again, I was inside a helicopter. A search and rescue team had found me. A pair of hikers had seen my car on the roadside days earlier and reported it when it was still there 4 days later. That triggered a small search. They used dogs and drones and eventually caught sight of the torn tarp I'd wrapped around myself. I had been out there 8.5 days. I had lost 26 pounds. My leg was infected. I had early-stage dehydration and mild hypothermia. They said if they'd found me one day later, I might have been dead. I didn't talk much to the rangers. I just told them I got turned around. They didn't ask for more. They said others had gotten lost in that part of the forest before. A few weren't found. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't go off-trail. I stick to the well-marked paths and the crowded parks. I still love the woods, but I don't. I had been hiking for years. It started as a weekend thing, just to escape the noise of the city. But over time, it became a big part of my life. There was something calming about walking deep into the forest, miles away from people, phones, and schedules. It gave me clarity. But sometimes nature doesn't care about your plans or peace of mind. Sometimes it throws you into situations you're not prepared for, even if you think you are. This happened to me 2 years ago, and I still think about it every single day. It was the first week of October. The weather was cold in the mornings and cool in the evenings. The leaves had started to change, and I wanted to take advantage of the season before winter hit. I had a 3-day weekend and decided to spend it hiking a lesser-known trail deep in the northern Rockies. The area wasn't totally remote, but it wasn't a well-traveled park either. A guy I'd met at a gear shop told me about a ridge trail near Timber Creek, somewhere out past an old logging road. He said it had amazing views and that not many people went out there anymore. That was enough to get me interested. I packed light but smart. My 70-liter pack held a small one-person tent, my sleeping bag, clothes for layering, my stove, a headlamp, a compass, some topo maps, and about 4 days of food. I also had a small emergency beacon, something I didn't always carry, but I figured I should because of how isolated this place sounded. I left early Friday morning, just as the sun was coming up. The drive to Timber Creek took almost 6 hours. The road after that was gravel and dirt, full of deep ruts and old tire tracks. I followed the directions the guy had written down for me, which eventually led me to a clearing with a broken-down sign that was barely readable. I parked there. The hike started off great. The trail was narrow and not well maintained, but it was there. Fallen branches and loose stones covered some sections, and I had to stop every few minutes to check the map. But the air was clean, and everything smelled like pine needles and earth. The climb wasn't too steep at first, and by midday I had made it a few miles up toward the base of the ridge. I kept hiking for the rest of the afternoon. Around 5 p.m., I found a flat spot just before the tree line and set up my tent. From there, I could see the edge of the ridge cutting across the sky. I ate some jerky, boiled water for tea, and sat by a small rock ledge to watch the sunset. There was no wind, no birds, just the sound of leaves falling now and then. That first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I slept hard and didn't wake up once. The next morning, I packed up early and started heading up toward the ridge. The trail became harder to follow. I had to backtrack a few times when I lost it. By noon, I had reached a narrow path that wrapped along the edge of a long slope. The ridge sat ahead like a stone backbone, stretching for miles. The wind picked up the higher I got. I kept my hood up, adjusted the straps on my pack, and kept going. I reached the top around 3 p.m. That's when things started to shift. There were old rock cairns up there, just small stacks here and there, like someone had tried to mark a path long ago. The trail became more of a guess than a route. I was already off the official maps at that point. I wasn't too worried. I had experience reading terrain and usually had a good sense of direction. I kept following the ridge west, thinking I could find a good descent on the other side and make a loop back to the car the next day. But I miscalculated. The trail faded completely after a while. Loose gravel crumbled under my boots, and the terrain turned rough. I had to scramble over some boulders and skirt around deep cuts in the ground where erosion had eaten through. I kept checking my compass. West, always west. Around 5 p.m., clouds started forming. The wind grew stronger and colder. I realized I had no decent place to camp up on the ridge. The rock was uneven, and the slope was too steep. I knew I had to drop elevation before nightfall, so I started climbing down the south side of the ridge, thinking I could find shelter in the trees below. That was a mistake. The descent was steep and full of loose rock. I went slow, using my hands and planting my feet carefully. I slipped once, caught myself, but it shook me. My thighs burned, and I was getting tired fast. I kept telling myself to just get to the trees, but they didn't seem to get any closer. I finally reached the treeline around 7 p.m. The light was fading fast. I found a small clearing and set up my tent as quickly as I could. I was shaking from the cold and exhaustion. I forced myself to eat a protein bar, drank some water, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I didn't feel right. My stomach was tight, and something felt off about the woods around me. Too quiet. No wind. No animal sounds. That night, I barely slept. At some point, I heard rustling near my tent. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't wind either. Something was moving outside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. It circled once. Then it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. Eventually, nothing. Just silence. I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. In the morning, I unzipped the tent slowly. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything. Just damp leaves and cold air. I shook it off. Probably a deer. Maybe a raccoon. I made a cup of instant coffee and looked at the map. I figured I was at least 10 miles off the original trail. I decided to head east and find a stream or creek. Water would mean a valley, and a valley might lead to a logging road or trail. I packed up and started walking. For the next few hours, I made slow progress. The forest was thick and uneven. Fallen logs blocked the way. The slope kept changing. I didn't see any water. Around noon, it started to rain. Not heavy, but steady enough to soak everything. I pulled on my rain cover and kept moving. Around 2 p.m., I found something strange. There was an old fire ring. Rocks stacked in a circle, black ash in the middle, and a rusted tin can nearby. It hadn't been used recently, but it meant someone had camped there before. I checked around for more signs, but there was nothing. No trail, no path, just the fire ring. I kept going, hoping it meant I was getting closer to civilization. But the forest kept pulling me deeper. I checked my compass again. East, I was sure, but something felt wrong. The terrain started to look the same in every direction. Trees leaned at odd angles. Branches blocked the sky. My legs were starting to cramp from the cold and damp. I kept pushing. Just before dark, I spotted what looked like a structure through the trees. I moved closer. It was a shack. Old, rotting, barely standing. Just 4 walls and part of a roof. The door was gone, and the inside was full of leaves and broken wood. I thought about sleeping in it, but it smelled like mold and animals. I pitched my tent nearby, in a spot that felt slightly safer. That night was worse than the last. I heard something again. This time it was heavier. Slow, deliberate steps. I could hear branches snap. I didn't move. I kept my knife in my hand, but I knew it wouldn't help much. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, just slow, heavy breathing. Then it walked away. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I was done pretending this was just a normal hike gone off track. I needed to get out. I stuffed everything into my pack and didn't even eat. I started moving northeast. If I kept that direction, I might cross the road I had come in on. But the forest kept dragging on. Hours passed. The rain started again. My boots were soaked. My fingers were stiff. I kept moving, but I started noticing something that really messed with my head. I passed the same fire ring. Not one like it. The same one. Same rusted tin can. Same moss-covered logs around it. I stood there in the rain, staring at it, trying to convince myself I'd made a mistake. But I knew. I had walked in a giant loop. Something was wrong with my sense of direction. I started to panic. I forced myself to calm down and check the compass. Still pointed east, but it didn't matter. The forest didn't make sense anymore. I started marking trees with my knife as I passed them. I walked for another hour. Then I saw one of my marks. I had doubled back again. I don't know how. I had gone straight. No turns. No detours. But there it was, my cut in the bark, fresh and clean. My chest felt tight. I couldn't think. I wanted to scream, but I knew that was useless. I kept going anyway. By the 4th day, I was out of food. My water was almost gone. My legs hurt with every step. My shoulders ached from the pack. My hands were scraped and bleeding from pushing through branches. I started drinking from puddles. I knew it wasn't safe, but I didn't care. Then, finally, I saw a break in the trees. A clear path. Dirt, but packed down. Not a road, more like an old ATV trail. It had tire marks, though faded. I dropped my pack and cried for the first time. I followed it for hours. The trail curved downhill, deeper into a valley. I kept walking. It was late October when I decided to take some time off work. I had been drowning in reports, meetings, and emails for months. I just wanted to be alone, away from people, away from noise. I didn't want to go to the beach or any city. I didn't want to visit friends or see anyone. I wanted the quiet of the mountains. I picked a trail in Montana called the Switchback Trail. I had never been there before, but it looked perfect. It was long, remote, and surrounded by rough terrain and forests. According to the map, it looped through hills and rocky valleys before turning back. It wasn't too popular, which was exactly what I wanted. I didn't need noise or company. I packed everything I thought I'd need for 5 days: tent, food, water filter, flashlight, knife, extra clothes, a first aid kit, emergency beacon, paper maps, and a GPS device. I even packed a few hand warmers since it was starting to get cold at night. I drove out early that morning. The trailhead was about 4 hours from where I lived. The parking lot was completely empty when I arrived. No other cars, no ranger station, not even a signboard. Just a wooden post with a faded arrow pointing toward the trail. The air was cold but dry, and there were thick clouds above the mountain peaks. I checked my GPS and map one more time, locked the car, and started walking. The first few hours were peaceful. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through pine trees, rocky hillsides, and grassy patches. I didn't see any signs of people. No footprints, no wrappers, no cut branches. Just deer tracks and the occasional pile of scat, probably from elk or mountain goats. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing and the soft crunch of dirt under my boots. I made camp just before sunset in a small clearing beside a stream. I set up my tent, boiled water for a dehydrated meal, and sat on a rock while eating. The trees were tall and still, and the stream made a soft, trickling sound. I hadn't seen any animals yet, but I kept my bear spray close. Before getting into my sleeping bag, I hung my food from a tree branch a good distance away from my tent. I had done this before on other hikes. I followed all the rules. No food in the tent, no crumbs, no scented items inside. That night, I woke up once around 2 a.m. to the sound of rustling leaves. It wasn't loud, just soft movement, like something walking slowly through the undergrowth. I stayed still and listened. It was probably a deer or a raccoon. I didn't move, didn't unzip the tent, just stayed awake for a while, staring into the dark. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The second day was tougher. The trail became steeper and the switchbacks started. I had to hike up and down through uneven, rocky ground. My thighs were burning by midday. I drank a lot of water and stopped more often to rest. I kept checking the map and GPS. Everything matched. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. By late afternoon, I came across something that looked like a faint side trail. It wasn't on the map, and it looked much older and less used. I kept going on the main path, but marked the spot in my notebook just in case. The forest started to thin out a bit, and I could see the ridge I was aiming for in the distance. I wanted to camp up there the next night. That evening, I set up camp again, this time near a patch of large rocks with a view of the valley below. I boiled more water for food, wrote a few notes in my journal, and watched the sky turn dark. That night, it got cold. My breath was visible even inside the tent. I bundled up tight and used the hand warmers. I didn't hear anything this time and slept straight through. The third day started early. I wanted to make it over the ridge and start the return loop by evening. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and I could smell snow in the air. I pushed through the trail faster, taking shorter breaks. The incline was harsh, and my backpack started to feel heavier than before. I was sweating under my jacket even in the cold air. As I climbed, I noticed that the trees were changing. They were shorter, more spaced out, with twisted trunks and patches of moss clinging to them. I passed through a few boulder fields where I had to use my hands to steady myself. Some of the rocks had deep grooves in them, like they'd been dragged or scratched by something. I figured it was just erosion or weather, but it made me stop and stare for a moment. When I reached the top of the ridge, the wind picked up. It was brutal. I pulled my hood tight and looked down at the path ahead. It dipped into a valley I hadn't seen on the map. I checked both the GPS and paper map. The trail was supposed to loop around, not dip this deep. I thought maybe the trail had shifted over time or I had taken a slight detour. It didn't seem dangerous, just unfamiliar. I walked for another hour before I realized something was off. The trail was becoming harder to follow. The dirt path had turned into a mix of loose stones and dry grass. There were no markers. I stopped and looked around. Behind me, the ridge was still visible, but ahead everything looked the same. Rolling hills, scattered trees, and rocks. I checked my GPS again. It showed I was still close to the marked trail, but the arrow kept spinning and losing signal. That's when I heard something. It was a distant, metallic clinking sound. Not fast, not loud. Just a single sound every few seconds. It echoed faintly across the valley. I froze and listened. It didn't repeat. I stood still for a minute, then convinced myself it was just some rock shifting or maybe even ice cracking from nearby water I couldn't see. I kept walking, slower this time. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it. The air felt different. My skin felt tight, and every time I stepped on a stick or loose stone, I jumped a little. I finally found a small clearing and decided to set up camp early. I was tired and didn't want to risk walking in the dark. That night, something woke me again. I didn't know what time it was because I didn't check. I just opened my eyes and felt strange. There was no sound at all, not even the wind. I couldn't hear the trees or the usual creaks of the forest. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I lay there, heart pounding. Then I heard the soft sound of something brushing against my tent. It wasn't tearing or scratching, just a light touch like something dragging a stick or maybe a branch across the fabric. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I stayed still for another hour at least before I fell back asleep from pure exhaustion. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. There were no prints, no markings, nothing to show anything had been there. But my food bag, which I had hung again, was gone. The rope had been cut. Not chewed, not torn, cut. Clean through. The bag itself was 10 feet away, torn open, everything inside gone. Even the sealed snack bars were taken. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. Not an animal. Person. I packed up fast and started walking back toward the ridge. I wanted out. I was supposed to finish the loop, but I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to go back the way I came. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't eat that morning, just drank water and kept moving. I reached the ridge by afternoon, but something was wrong again. The path I had used to get up wasn't there, or at least it didn't look the same. There were tracks, but not mine. Boot prints, larger than mine and fresh. I followed them for a while, thinking they'd lead me back, but the tracks zigzagged, doubled back, and then stopped completely in the middle of a flat section of land, like someone had walked in circles and vanished. I stood there, staring, my skin cold and tight. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I hid beneath a low rock shelf, curled in my sleeping bag, knife in my hand. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake all night, eyes wide open, listening to the trees and every tiny sound. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but I couldn't be sure. My ears were ringing from how hard I was trying to listen. The next morning, I started walking again. I didn't know exactly where I was anymore. My GPS was dead. I had dropped it or smashed it, I couldn't remember. The map didn't help now. Everything looked the same: gray rocks, twisted trees, patches of moss. I just picked a direction and walked. It took me 2 more days to find my way back to the trailhead. I was out of food. I had only a few sips of water left. My lips were cracked, and my legs were covered in cuts and bruises. I had fallen several times. I had slept maybe 4 hours total in those last 2 nights. I didn't hear or see anyone else, but I always had the feeling that I was being followed, watched from a distance, but always there. The hairs on my neck never went down. I moved fast, only stopping to rest for a few minutes at a time. I didn't set up camp again. I just kept going. When I finally saw the empty parking lot, I broke down. I fell to my knees and just stared at my car for a long time. The same wooden post with the faded arrow was still there, like none of it had happened. I got in, locked the doors, and drove straight home without stopping once. Took me weeks. I had planned that hiking trip for weeks. My goal was to disconnect from everything, no phone, no computer, no people. I wanted silence, open space, cold water from mountain streams, and nights lit only by the moon. I didn't need company. I'd always been fine being alone, sometimes better off that way. I picked a lesser-known trail in northern Montana. It was deep in the backcountry, with few marked paths and only a couple of online reviews from other hikers. It started off a logging road that was barely drivable. That was part of the appeal. I didn't want anything easy. I drove up in my old SUV, carrying a full pack, extra fuel, a small tent, a solar charger, and food for a week. I even brought backup water purification tablets and an emergency beacon in case I got hurt. I'd done trips like this before, but this one felt different. Not bad, just bigger, more remote. By the time I parked at the makeshift trailhead, the sun was high. The road behind me had been rocky and steep, and my tires spun more than once. My plan was to follow a loop that dipped south through the trees, crossed a creek, passed through 2 ridges, and circled back after 5 or 6 days. The reviews said there were unmaintained paths that cut across the loop, but I ignored those. They were barely marked and not mapped. I stuck to the main plan. I spent the first 2 days moving deeper into the woods. The trail was quiet and narrow, soft underfoot, and littered with fallen branches. On the second night, I camped near a stream and listened to nothing but water and wind. I hadn't seen another person since the start, and I liked it that way. By the 3rd day, I started to feel the strain. My shoulders ached. My knees popped when I stood up. My feet felt like wood, but it was good pain. It meant I was really out here. My signal was long gone, the weather was holding, and everything was going to plan. That's when I made the mistake. I was supposed to continue east and loop around the ridge, but the trail had become a mess. Fallen trees blocked the path. Mudslides from the spring melt had torn up sections. After hours of pushing through thickets and climbing over trunks, I saw a narrow offshoot heading northeast, one of those unmaintained paths mentioned online. I looked at my map. If it connected the way I thought, it would save me half a day. It looked walkable. There were faded marks on the trees, old orange tape, sun-bleached and torn, probably flagged years ago. I figured I could handle it. I'd done worse before, so I left the main trail and took the cut across. First, it wasn't bad. It narrowed quickly, winding between trees that leaned over it like a tunnel. Branches scraped my pack. Pine needles blanketed the ground. I had to duck under low limbs, and more than once I slipped on hidden roots. But I was still making progress. Then the trail vanished. It didn't happen all at once. It just sort of faded into the woods. The tape stopped. The path narrowed to nothing. I walked forward, looking for the next sign, but all I saw were trees and uneven ground. I backtracked, thinking I missed a turn, but that didn't help. I checked my compass and GPS. The GPS wouldn't lock in. I tried again. Still no signal. My solar charger was fine. The device was fine. But something about the trees or the cover overhead must have been messing with it. My compass needle spun, wobbled, then settled. I started walking again, slow and careful, trying to follow where I thought the trail had been. By the time I admitted I was off track, I'd already burned 2 hours. The sun had dropped below the ridge, and the shadows were long. My legs were scratched from pushing through brush, and I was starting to feel uneasy. I decided to set up camp. I cleared a small patch beneath a tree, set up my tent, and boiled water for a meal. The forest felt different here, too still. The trees were tall and tightly packed. The undergrowth was thick. I heard no wind, no birds, no animals. I lay in my tent that night staring at the nylon ceiling, listening. Nothing, just silence. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. I felt watched, even though I knew that was just my mind playing tricks. I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and tried to retrace my steps, but it was useless. The forest had no clear landmarks. Everything looked the same: trees, rocks, moss. I checked the compass again, pointed south. I followed it, hoping I could intersect the main trail again. But the terrain got worse. I started climbing over uneven rock and dropping into little gullies filled with mud and old leaves. At one point, I slipped and twisted my knee. I didn't fall, but it hurt. A sharp, deep pain on the outside of the joint. I tested my weight on it. It held, but barely. I kept going. Around midday, I found a clearing. It wasn't much, just a wide, flat patch where the trees thinned. It looked like someone had camped there before. Old blackened stones from a fire pit, broken branches nearby, a torn scrap of tarp, faded blue, lying in the dirt. That should have comforted me. Proof that someone else had been here, but it didn't. It looked too old, too forgotten, like someone had left it in a hurry and never came back. I rested there and ate half a protein bar. My knee was swelling. My water was low. The stream I expected to find on this side hadn't appeared, and the trees were growing thicker again. I picked a direction and kept going. That afternoon was a blur of pushing through dense woods, climbing deadfalls, and stumbling over roots. I was getting tired, dehydrated. I hadn't seen the sun in hours because the tree cover was too thick. I didn't know if I was walking in circles. I thought about the beacon in my bag, the emergency GPS that could call a chopper. But I didn't press it. Not yet. Not unless it got worse. It got worse. That night, I camped on a slope. My tent barely fit. The ground was damp and sloped just enough that I kept sliding in my sleeping bag. Every sound outside made me flinch. A crack, a rustle, a low thud, probably animals, maybe just trees creaking. But my gut said otherwise. Something was moving nearby. I held my knife in my hand as I lay awake. The fourth day, I woke up soaked. Condensation had dripped into the tent. My knee was stiff and hot. Walking hurt. I could only move slow now, limping badly. Every few steps, pain shot up my leg. I finally gave up on guessing where I was and took out the beacon. I held it in my hand for a long time. I thought about how dumb it would look. Hiker gets lost and calls for rescue after trying to take a shortcut. I'd get charged for the chopper ride. I'd probably end up on the local news. But pride wasn't going to save me. I pressed the button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. No light, no sound. I opened the back. The battery was fine. It wasn't water damaged. It should have worked, but it didn't. I sat down and stared at the trees. That's when it hit me, really hit me. I was lost. Not just off the trail. Not just behind schedule. I was deep in the woods, injured, running out of food and water, with no working GPS, no working beacon, no trail, and no clear way out. I stood up and kept walking anyway. I had to try. I limped through the rest of that day. Around late afternoon, I saw something in the distance. Metal. Shiny. I pushed toward it and found an old fence. Rusted and twisted. Probably for cattle, though there were no farms for miles. But fences meant people. At least they used to. I followed it downhill, weaving through trees. It led to a broken gate and an overgrown road. Not paved, just hard-packed dirt, rutted and soft from age. But it was a road that gave me hope. I followed it. I don't know how far I walked. My leg was throbbing. I drank the last of my water. The sky above was getting dark again. I needed shelter. I kept my eyes open. Then I saw the structure. It was a small building, maybe the size of a shed. Wood with a sloped roof and no windows. The door hung half open. I checked it. Empty inside. Just dirt and old cans. But it was shelter. I set up my tent inside it, just the inner mesh to keep bugs off, and lay down. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Something was out there. Not a person. Not an animal. Just movement. Branches snapping. Leaves crunching. Once, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps in the gravel outside, but when I looked, nothing was there. I stayed like that until dawn. On the 5th day, I kept following the road. My knee was useless now. I had to use a branch as a crutch. I was starving, dizzy, dry-mouthed. I knew if I didn't find water, I'd pass out. Mid-morning, I saw a shape in the distance. Another building, bigger this time. It was an old cabin. The windows were boarded up. The roof sagged in the middle. One wall had graffiti on it, names, maybe a date. I banged on the door. No one answered. Pushed it open. Inside was dusty, but intact. A broken table, an old chair, a pile of firewood. I've always liked being alone in nature. Something about the quiet, the trees, the wind brushing against the leaves. It helps me clear my head. I used to hike a lot when I was younger, mostly around areas I already knew. But in my early 30s, I started branching out. I wanted new places, new trails, something that felt more untouched. That's how I ended up driving out to a remote mountain range a few hours from where I lived. I'd never hiked there before, but I found a trail online that looked perfect. It was long, not too steep, and not too popular. That was important to me. I liked being away from people. The day started off normal. I parked at the lot near the trailhead around 7 o'clock in the morning. The lot was gravel and only had one other car in it, which I liked. The air was cool, and the sun had just started coming through the trees. I locked up my car, strapped on my backpack, and started walking. The trail was peaceful. Trees lined both sides, and the dirt path was narrow but well-trodden. There were no big markers or signs, just those occasional wooden posts that told you how far you were from certain points. I had the map downloaded on my phone and a printed version too, just in case. I had plenty of water, some food, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. I'd done this kind of thing before. A few hours in, I reached a fork in the trail. It wasn't marked on the printed map, and there was nothing on the post nearby to tell me which way led where. I checked my phone, but the GPS was slow to load. I figured it didn't matter too much. Both paths looked well worn. One went slightly uphill and curved into the woods. The other stayed mostly level and seemed to follow a ridgeline. I took the one that curved upward. I don't really know why. I just felt like it. At first, it didn't feel like anything was off. The trail was steep in parts, but manageable. The forest got denser. The higher I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No more old fire rings or footprints. After about an hour, I noticed the trail started to fade. It went from a clear dirt path to something more like a game trail, narrower, with grass and small branches pushing into it from both sides. I kept going. I thought maybe I'd just taken a less used loop. The GPS still hadn't loaded anything, and I hadn't seen another person since I parked the car. After another 30 minutes, the trail was gone completely. I was standing in the woods with nothing but trees around me. At first, I thought maybe I'd missed a bend or switchback. I turned around and tried to retrace my steps, but after walking for about 10 minutes, I couldn't even find the path I came from. It was like the forest had closed behind me. I wasn't panicked yet. I'd been in the woods plenty of times. I pulled out my map, but nothing on it looked familiar. I tried checking my phone again, but the signal was gone. The map app just showed a loading screen. I switched it to airplane mode to save battery. I figured if I kept heading downhill, I'd eventually hit the main trail again. Most trails are built along ridgelines, and heading down usually leads you to water or a road. So that's what I did. The problem was that going downhill wasn't as easy as it sounded. The trees were thick, and the ground was uneven. There were fallen branches, loose rocks, and hidden holes covered with leaves. After about 30 minutes of climbing down slowly, I slipped. My foot hit a patch of moss-covered rock, and I fell sideways, sliding a few feet down the slope. I landed hard against a tree. My ankle hurt immediately. I knew I hadn't broken it, but it was badly twisted. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing heavily and trying to get myself together. The pain was sharp, but I could still move it. I wrapped it with an ace bandage from my first aid kit and stood up slowly. It hurt, but I could walk. By now, the sun was lower in the sky. I had maybe 3 or 4 hours of light left. I knew I couldn't make it back to my car that day. I didn't even know where the car was anymore. I looked around for a place to camp. I didn't bring a tent, just a sleeping bag and tarp, but I knew how to make a decent shelter if I had to. I found a flat spot near the base of a hill, cleared away some branches and pine needles, and set up the tarp between two trees. I made a small fire using my lighter and a pile of dry twigs. I didn't need the fire for warmth, it wasn't too cold, but the light made me feel safer. I ate a protein bar and drank some water. I still had plenty of supplies. That night was long. The forest was loud. I heard things walking around, maybe deer, maybe raccoons. Every crack of a branch made me sit up and listen. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed up and started walking downhill again. My ankle was stiff and sore. I moved slower. The forest all looked the same, green, brown, shadows, and no sign of people. I didn't see any wrappers, footprints, nothing. Around midday, I found a small stream. I drank some water after using my filter and filled my bottles. I followed the stream for a while, thinking it might lead to a bigger river or even a road. But it didn't. It just snaked through a narrow canyon and disappeared into thick brush. That night, I set up camp again. I was more tired this time, mentally and physically. I'd been walking all day, and my ankle was getting worse. I built another fire, but smaller, trying to save my lighter's fuel. I had matches too, but I didn't want to waste them either. I started thinking about how long it might take someone to notice I was gone. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, just the general area. I figured someone might report me missing if I didn't show up to work in a few days. But that wasn't a guarantee. On the third day, the hunger really started to set in. I had a few more protein bars and some trail mix, but it wasn't enough. I was burning a lot of energy walking all day, and I was getting weaker. I started chewing on pine needles just to keep my mouth from drying out too much. I kept moving slowly, hoping to find a road or a cabin or anything. In the afternoon, I heard something that made my heart race. Engine noise. I stopped and listened. It was far away, but it was definitely a vehicle. I started yelling, but no one could hear me. I tried climbing a small ridge to get a better view, but I was too slow. By the time I got to the top, the sound was gone. Nothing in sight but trees and distant mountains. That crushed me. I sat there for a while, staring out over the trees, feeling more alone than I ever had before. I kept walking. Every hour felt slower. My ankle was swelling more. My legs were sore. My backpack felt heavier even though I was eating and drinking from it. That night, I didn't make a fire. I was too tired. I lay under the tarp, listening to the wind move through the trees. Something walked past my camp at one point, big, slow steps. I held my breath. Whatever it was didn't stop. The next morning, I was dizzy when I stood up. My water was low and I had no more food. I chewed gum just to keep my mouth moving. My body felt slow, like it didn't want to do this anymore, but I made myself move. That day, I saw something that gave me a little hope. A boot print, a real human footprint, pressed into the soft mud near a trickle of water. It was old, but it was real. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had passed through. I followed the direction it came from, hoping maybe they had gone towards civilization. The ground got rocky again, and the trees thinned out. By late afternoon, I saw a sign, an actual wooden sign nailed to a tree. It said Service Road 12 with an arrow. I limped in that direction. My body felt like it was on autopilot. My head hurt, and my lips were cracked. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. An hour later, I saw gravel. A road. A real dirt service road. I cried. I didn't even mean to. It just happened. I followed it downhill, and 2 hours later, I saw the back end of a cabin, just a small ranger outpost. There was no one there when I got inside, but I found a radio and used it to call for help. My voice barely worked, but someone heard me. They came about an hour later in a Forest Service truck. I couldn't even say much when they found me. I just nodded. They gave me water, checked my ankle, and told me I was lucky. I'd wandered nearly 12 miles off any known trail. It took a few days for me to fully recover, but I never forgot how it felt out there. Completely alone, unsure which direction was safe, counting every sip of water and bite of food, watching the sun drop behind the trees while I was still lost. I haven't hiked alone since, not because I'm afraid of nature, but because I know how easy it is to make one small mistake and end up in a fight to survive. And the scariest part of it all? There was no one out there trying to hurt me. That was the problem. There was no one out there at all. I've always liked hiking alone. It gives me space to think, and I like the quiet. I've done most of the longer trails in my region, but last summer I decided to try something new. I heard about a less popular trail called Ridge Trail up north. It wasn't one of those well-known tourist spots, and that's what pulled me in. I wasn't looking for scenic views for social media. I wanted isolation, challenge, and something that felt real. I left on a Friday morning in late June. The weather was good, sunny, but not too hot. I drove about 4 hours to the trailhead. The parking lot was almost empty, just one other car. That was a good sign to me. It meant fewer people. I packed my gear, food for 3 days, my tent, sleeping bag, cooking stuff, a map, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, and a first aid kit. My phone had no service, but I expected that. I downloaded an offline map just in case, but I still preferred using the compass. The Ridge Trail loop was around 30 miles in total, cutting through hills, forest, and some steep rocky stretches. I planned to finish it in 2.5 days. That meant hiking most of the day, stopping to camp before sunset, and heading out early each morning. Nothing extreme, just steady and careful. The first few hours were smooth. The trail was clear and well-marked with faded red ribbons tied to branches and some carved signs on tree trunks. The forest was thick, mostly pine and birch, and I liked the way the light filtered through the canopy. The ground was a mix of dry soil, roots, and rocks. I kept a good pace, drank water regularly, and enjoyed the quiet. I passed a small stream around midday and filled my bottle using my water filter. I sat there for a while, ate a peanut butter sandwich, and just listened to the wind in the trees. There were no planes overhead, no cars in the distance. Just birds, water, and the occasional cracking branch from animals I couldn't see. That kind of silence is rare. It makes you feel small, but in a good way. By evening, I found a flat spot near a clearing to set up camp. I made sure it wasn't too close to any water sources to avoid animals. I cooked some noodles, set up my tent, and crawled in just after it got dark. The night was uneventful. No strange noises, no rustling too close for comfort. Just peaceful darkness. I fell asleep quickly. The second day started early. I woke up at sunrise, packed up, and got moving. The trail started to climb that day, heading up toward the ridge the trail was named after. The terrain got tougher. Rocks got sharper. Some parts were narrow and edged with steep drops. I had to watch every step. A few hours in, I noticed that the trail markers started to fade. I passed one ribbon that looked old and shredded, hanging by just a thread. A few minutes later, the path split into two. There was no sign or marker showing which way was correct. I checked my compass and map. The map wasn't detailed enough to show small splits. I guessed and took the path that continued upward, figuring the ridge would be higher up anyway. The trail got tighter and steeper. I used my hands a few times to scramble over rocks. The ground was loose in some places. At one point, I slid a little and caught myself just before tumbling down a steep drop. My heart was racing, but I kept going. I didn't want to waste time backtracking. I was sure I was still going the right way. About an hour later, the trail opened up to a narrow ledge overlooking the forest. It was beautiful, but I was getting tired. I checked the map again. Still hard to tell where I was exactly, but the compass said I was moving generally north, which seemed right. I rested there, had a granola bar, and pushed forward. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist a bit. I hadn't seen a trail marker in over an hour. No ribbons, no carved signs. And the trail was starting to fade into what looked more like a game path. Thin, uneven, sometimes blocked by brush. I slowed down and kept looking around for a marker. Nothing. I decided to backtrack. I turned around and started heading down. After just a few minutes, I hit another split I hadn't noticed before. That confused me. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. I picked the one that looked more walked on, but after 20 minutes, I didn't recognize anything. The ground felt different. The trees were denser. There were fallen logs that I didn't remember stepping over. I turned back again, frustrated. I tried the other path at the split. Still nothing familiar. That's when it hit me. I was lost. I stopped walking and took a few deep breaths. I wasn't panicked yet, but I felt the edge of it creeping in. I took out my map again, studied the compass, tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong. But it all looked the same now. The trees were just trees. The rocks were just rocks. And without trail markers, there was no way to be sure. I decided to keep heading downhill. I figured if I could find the stream from the first day, I could follow it back to the original trail. I hiked down for what felt like hours. My legs were getting sore, and my water bottle was running low. The stream didn't show up. The sun started lowering again, casting long shadows between the trees. I found a small clearing and set up camp for the second night. This time I wasn't relaxed. I barely ate. I just boiled some water, drank it, and lay in the tent, trying to figure out my next move. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside the tent made me freeze. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just animals. Still, I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed up and headed further downhill. Around mid-morning, I found something strange. A boot print. Not mine. It was fresh, maybe a day old. It was headed downhill like I was. I followed the prints, heart racing a little. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. Maybe the person whose car I saw at the trailhead had gone this way too. The prints led to another fork in the trees. I kept following them down and down. Eventually, I reached a flat area and spotted what looked like part of an old wooden structure through the trees. It was broken and weathered. I walked closer and realized it was the remains of a hunting blind or a small cabin, mostly collapsed. There was no one around, no gear, no signs of recent human activity. I circled it a few times. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The boot prints disappeared in the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. I thought about climbing a tree to get a better view, but the forest was too thick. There were no clearings big enough to give me a real vantage point. By midday, I decided I needed to conserve energy. I stopped hiking and stayed put near the ruined cabin. I rationed my food and water. I marked the area with bright strips from my emergency blanket, just in case someone came looking. I tried turning my phone on again. Still no signal. That night, it rained. The sound of rain on the tent was constant. Water leaked in near the bottom. Everything felt colder. My clothes got damp. I stayed curled in the sleeping bag, trying to stay warm. I barely slept again. The next day, I was hungry, cold, and frustrated. I decided to head west, following the position of the sun, hoping to find a road or a bigger water source. I hiked all day through uneven terrain. I slipped twice. On the second fall, I scraped my leg on a rock. It wasn't deep, but it bled enough to soak through my pant leg. I cleaned it with what little clean water I had and wrapped it with gauze from the first aid kit. I kept moving. My steps got slower. I had no idea how many miles I'd walked at that point. By afternoon, I saw something through the trees, a break in the forest. I pushed toward it and came out on a narrow dirt road. I almost cried from relief. I didn't know where it led, but I followed it west, limping slightly. An hour later, a pickup truck came around a bend. I stepped into the middle of the road and waved both arms. The driver stopped and stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. I must have looked like hell. He gave me water and a granola bar, then drove me to the nearest ranger station about 30 miles away. I told them everything. They checked the trail. I had gone off the main path about 6 miles before the ridge. The split I'd followed wasn't part of the trail at all. It was an old game path that had been mistaken by a few other hikers in the past. The rangers had planned to clear that section, but it hadn't happened yet. They said I was lucky. Most people who got lost that far in either found the road or never did. My name was added to a long list of hikers who had veered off that same trail and gotten turned around. I spent a night in a small local clinic, mostly for the leg wound and dehydration. After that, I headed home. That trip changed the way I hike. I still go out alone sometimes, but I take extra gear now, signal mirrors, a satellite beacon, even a whistle. I mark my own trail as I go, and I check my direction every half hour. I don't trust faint paths, and I don't assume I'll always find my way back. Getting lost out there doesn't feel like the movies. There's no music, no monsters, no dramatic rescues. Slow, quiet, and hard. It wears you down bit by bit until you're just another